welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin, as always, and today I'm going to discuss 10 African American female artists that I think you should know about because they not only were significant during their lifetime, but they were able to really trailblaze for people that would follow behind them and make it possible for a community that has been so long oppressed to be able to voice their experiences for, if not the first time, then one of the first times. Today I'm having peach tea because summer is coming along and I'm just getting so excited because peaches and nectarines and apricots are coming into season, and I just love fresh fruit, you guys. Like, I could eat just like nice cold fresh fruit by the truckload. It's wonderful. Anyway, so number one on the list is probably somebody that you'll already know. Her name is Ella Fitzgerald, and Ella Fitzgerald was a famous jazz singer who had a very prosperous 6-decade career, and she was known by the title of the First Lady of Song. And she's very impressive because she's won over 13 Grammys and she's sold over 40 million albums. And during her career, she was able to work with all sorts of other famous singers like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole, just to name a few. A lot of her works are very interesting because she presents a lot of dynamics with her voice. She can go from singing something very smooth and softly to switching to scats with a very jazzy style. She's very multidimensional in the way that she can sing. So when Fitzgerald was a child, she grew up during the Harlem Renaissance, and I think it's very likely that she could have been influenced by that. Actually, one thing you need to kind of know going in, if you don't know what the Harlem Renaissance is, the Harlem Renaissance was a movement of African American art. It's called the Harlem Renaissance because it was mainly based in Harlem, New York, and there was just this great period of experimentation with literature and music and visual art in which African American artists were able to voice their culture and their experiences in a way that they hadn't really been able to do as freely before. But Ella Fitzgerald, she began to fall on hard times when she was growing into a young woman. She had to work multiple side jobs to help her family, and some of her loved ones also died, and this led to a great deal of sadness, and that compounded with the start of the Great Depression. She is a very hurt 15-year-old girl who's on her own and having to deal with the world. But luckily, her luck turned around when she won the opportunity to compete in a talent showcase, and she originally planned on dancing, but she was kind of intimidated by some of the other people that were there, so she changed her mind and decided to sing instead. And it's said that originally when she went up on stage, people were booing at her and telling her to get off the stage, but when she sang, afterwards they were just screaming for an encore. They absolutely loved her. Before she knew it, she was traveling and recording, and her fame was just beginning to grow. However, she faced a great deal of discrimination in her career, and in one instance, she was scheduled to perform at a nightclub, but they ended up canceling her, and yet when she showed up to be informed that she wasn't going to sing, the managers still asked her for autographs even after they canceled her, which is just it's unbelievable. And a lot of you have probably heard the story about her and Marilyn Monroe. She said that she owed Marilyn Monroe a great debt because she played at the Macombo, which was a very popular nightclub in the 50s. And Marilyn Monroe personally called the owner of Macombo and told the owner that she wanted Ella to be booked immediately. And if she did it, then Marilyn would sit at a front table every night, and that would bring in great press for the club. So he said yes. The press came in, and not only, did they focus on Marilyn, but they were able to witness Ella's talent in real time and be able to notice her and to document her skill and her talents. And some people debate about whether or not Ella wasn't allowed to perform at that particular nightclub based on her race, or if she just wasn't popular enough. But either way, after this point, she was able to get a lot of exposure. And even though she had wonderful instances like this of help and support from people not only that worked with her personally, but people in a similar career field as hers. She was just an incredibly hard worker, and she never gave up on herself or her audience. And people know her not only for her art, but her generosity and her kindness and dedication. She began to donate a lot of money to charities to help those less fortunate than her, because she could sympathize with them based on the upbringing that she had and the struggles that she had to endure to get to where she was. And what's significant about her music is that she, like I said, she's very multidimensional. Her ability to perform in these different ways created a fan base that transcended race and religions and classes, and so her music became a common ground for people to put aside their differences. So next we have Augusta Savage, and she was a very talented sculptor and teacher. When the Harlem Renaissance took place, she was able to be a part of this explosion of African American art and expression in so many ways. Augusta Savage had originally grown up in Florida, and she was very interested in working with clay from a young age, but her father discouraged her throughout her childhood to stray away from her artistic interests, even, as Savage said, going to the point where he almost whipped the art out of me. He would physically beat her to discourage her. But she would go on to enter some of her figures into a county fair, and she won special recognition and a ribbon of honor. And after that, she decided to move to Jacksonville, Florida, with the hopes of supporting herself by sculpting portraits of prominent blacks in the community. But shortly after this, she decided to go to New York instead and be a part of this great movement of art in Harlem. So she earned a reputation as a portrait sculptor, and even went on to portray the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, and her work was so outstanding that she won a fellowship to study in Paris and to travel throughout France and Belgium and Germany. And one of the works that particularly gained recognition for this fellowship is a sculpture of her young nephew known as Gamine. And it's noted for its detail, and not only just the technical detail of being able to portray this boy with his big hat on and his kind of scruffy collar, but also the emotion behind his eyes, the eagerness that he has, the adventure, all the energy that he has to offer. He's just flowing with life, even though it is just a still medium. And so after her time in Europe, she took all that she learned and began to teach others in Harlem about the arts. And in 1934, she became the first African-American member of the National Association of Women's Painters and Sculptors. And she was even commissioned by the New York World's Fair to create a sculpture with the specific prompt of encapsulating the musical works and accomplishments of African Americans. This inspired her to create her sculpture known as the harp. It was sort of meant to be different figures in the shape of a harp, kind of singing in a various sort of choir formation, because she was tying it into gospel music, and so much of that had ties to African heritage. It was a way of portraying something that could bring to mind the aesthetics in an audio-visual sort of way. And it's just so sad. Sadly, this work was destroyed. Some people have recreated it and stuff, but a lot of works of art after the fair in that year were destroyed, and it's just heartbreaking to think about. But after this, she decided to return to a quiet life with her daughter, and she worked more to teach local children about the arts, and she also did artwork for tourists that were coming through the area. Even though she kind of took a step back afterwards, for all the work that she did, she is especially significant because even though she did step away from the spotlight, she worked so hard and became a trailblazer for other African American women in the art field. She was very humble too. She would say that her works weren't really anything that she should be known for. She wanted to be known for the works that her students were able to do. She wanted to be able to influence others to create wonderful art. There's also a special relationship between art teachers and their students, and she was very grateful to have the chance to nourish those sorts of relationships. And up next we have Elizabeth Cartlett, And she was a graphic artist and sculptor who focused on portraying the experience of African Americans in the 20th century. And she had a particular focus on the experience of African American women. So she was the granddaughter of freed slaves, and this was significant because she grew up hearing eyewitness accounts of capture from Africa and the torturous life of slavery. And her parents worked both as educators, and she became fascinated with art in her youth. She was actually admitted into the Carnegie Institute of Technology, but they took her offer away when they found out that she was black. So she decided instead to study at Howard University, and there she learned about printmaking and design and art theory. And during the Great Depression, the government funded a great deal of art projects to employ artists, and she actually was able to work as a muralist with the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration. She was really encouraged by her professors to share her art and this really interesting message that she was telling about the Black experience in America. So while she worked on her art, she also held various teaching positions. And what's interesting is actually during the communism scare of the late 1940s and early 1950s, she was actually placed under investigation by, the name of this committee always, it's lengthy, but it's just so funny to me. It's the United States House of Un-American Activities Committee, which was basically a committee specifically meant to snuff out the communists living among the Americans. So yeah. Then in 1962, she gained Mexican citizenship and was able to gain some more influence from her experiences there. And she really liked printmaking in particular because it was not only affordable for the artist to make, but it's easy to kind of recreate and share with others. And so that made things really easily accessible for people that wanted to view her art. And she also illustrated both famous subjects such as Harriet Tubman and Malcolm X, but she also had an emphasis on unknown African American women, and she really sought to express various different emotions. And if you look up some of her works, there's one sculpture named Tired, and then there's a print called The Sharecropper, and in the small details of these works, you can really see on their faces and their eyes just this turmoil and fatigue that she had witnessed and wanted to take the time to recreate in her art so that others could understand a bit more just what her people had experienced. Her work was somewhat more abstract and modernist with its influences, and they have this interesting blend of African and American art traditions, but ultimately she wanted to portray art as something beyond just aesthetically pleasing. She wanted to create something that left a message, and she said that she wasn't really looking to become famous, but she wanted to create art for a community that had been excluded for such a long time. So next we have Audre Lorde, and she was an author of poetry, essays, and she wrote an autobiography, and she in particular cared about racial issues in America, as well as issues of homophobia and misogyny. And so growing up in New York, she developed this fascination for poetry. I loved reading this description of her childhood. She loved reading poems, and she would constantly recite them and memorize them. When people would ask her questions, she would reply with lines from poems. It's just such a fascinating thing. But she said that as she went on to study more poems, if there were things that she wanted to say that she couldn't quite find represented in other poetry, she decided around the age of about 12 or 13 that she could take up a pen and start to write things out herself and express how she felt. So when she went to university, she studied library sciences, and she worked as a librarian in New York public schools during the 1960s. And during this time, she actually married a white homosexual man named Edward Rollins, and they were married for 8 years, but they ended up divorcing. And shortly afterwards, Audre met her lifelong partner, Francis Clayton. She also started a career as a teacher, as a poet in residence, and she gained renown by publishing various essays and anthologies of poetry, which really focused on her political views and her thoughts, and they contain a lot of really rich imagery and allusions to classical works and mythology and things that, interestingly enough, have been held in such kind of unattainable status unless you were especially well educated. She was able to kind of bring things down to more of a common ground. She also developed analytical literary theories, and she drew on contemporary feminist thought, black feminism, and lesbian feminism. And she also drew a lot on her own experience. So she was essentially fighting on 3 different fronts to get equality as a homosexual, as a woman, and as an African American. So she brings to the table this really unique experience. And she wanted to be able to bring to light these particular lenses through which one could view the world. And her work has often been deemed multicultural. I think some people worry that if art focuses somewhat on a specific ethnicity or community, that they can't engage with it, that they can't fully understand it. But she is a great example of how her art isn't meant to be exclusive. It's meant to be cathartic for people that share her experiences, but also educational for people that don't. And she advocated against kind of separate entities, but also really envisioned and advocated for a world where people could come together as a generally good and peaceful whole, but without losing their individual identities. Also, I realized partway through that I wasn't actually numbering the list, so I apologize for that. And for those that I did number, the order doesn't have any specific meaning. I'm not ranking them at all by talent or by significance. I think they're all significant and talented in their own ways. So next we have Selma Burke, and she was another artist that was active during the Harlem Renaissance, and she was also a sculptor, and she's most famously known for creating the portrait of FDR that would later inspire the portrait that could be found on the dime. And as a child, she grew up in North Carolina, and this was a story that I loved. She kind of first gained her interest in clay by playing in a riverbed near her house and just playing with the riverbed clay that she found. Her grandmother was also a painter and greatly encouraged her artistic abilities and expression, but her mom was really worried that she wouldn't be able to find a job that would support her financially. But Selma would continue to have this draw to clay. She said when she really got to handle nice clay for the first time, she said that it felt like it was something that needed to be a part of her, was something that she needed to do. It was part of who she was. She later married a childhood friend, but within a year she was widowed, and she then moved to New York to work as a nurse. And here she discovered this wonderful community of artists that would go on to support her. And as she was able to gain experience and work on her art, she eventually began to teach at an art center under the leadership of Augusta Savage. She even worked for the New Deal Federal Art Project, and she won a fellowship to study in Vienna, but after staying there for a few years, remember this is during the mid-1930s, so she's starting to see the rise of fascism and Nazism. She had a particular experience that would inspire her to flee Europe due to the rising dangers. She did a portrait for a lady named Frau Keller, which is also the name of this portrait, and she was a German Jewish woman, and she told Selma about her fears for the dangers that were coming and encouraged her to leave and escape now while she could. And so she did, and after she returned to the United States, she founded the Selma Burke School of Sculpture in New York City. But shortly after, America entered the war following the Pearl Harbor attack, and during the war, she worked as a truck driver, and she said that artists needed to get out of their studios and help. She thought it was the responsibility of everybody to pitch in during this time of crisis, which I think is very admirable. I think it shows a lot about her character and just how brave she was. And she also continued to share her passion for art after the war ended. She opened art educational centers in New York and in Pittsburgh, and she also used her art to help bring people together. In one instance, in Mooresville, there was a ban at the public library that prevented Black children from being able to enter, and Burke made a bust of a local doctor and said she would donate it to the library on the condition that the ban would be lifted, and she donated the bust and the ban was lifted. And her main concern with art was portraying the human form both in a realistic way but also a symbolic way. She said that she wanted to make art not just for today but also for something that would hold significance for all time. That was something she aspired to do with all of her art as well. She wanted to do something that wouldn't just be part of a fad. She wanted to do something that would be significant long after she was gone. So up next we have Frances Harper, and she was an author and social reformer who wrote poetry and different essays that discussed abolitionism and women's suffrage. And what's really cool about her is she was one of the first African American women to be published in the United States. So she was the daughter of freed slaves, but they actually died while she was very young, and she went on to be raised by her aunt and uncle. And her uncle was a civil rights activist, and he was a very outspoken abolitionist, and he had a great deal of influence not only on her and her beliefs, but also what she would go on to write about. When Frances was a teenager, she was a maid for a white family who owned a bookstore, and in her spare time between her duties, she would go through the books and read them, and this eventually inspired her to put her own ideas to paper, and she published her first book of poetry at the age of 20. She emphasized the hardships faced by Black people throughout the centuries, and an example of this is in The Slave Mother, and it's something that's really emotionally gripping. She discusses the anguish of a mother who has given birth to a son who at any moment may be taken from her to be sold to someone else. That was one of the really terrible hardships about slavery, one of the cruelties of it, that people that you knew as your family, the people that were your flesh and blood, could be separated from you at just about any moment. There really wasn't any sort of security or stability. It's just an awful thing to have to fathom, whether or not you're going to be able to stay with your loved ones. And that was something that she really wanted to demonstrate. And she eventually went on to become a teacher, and she joined the American Anti-Slavery Society. And people were so impressed with her that she went on to become a traveling lecturer in tours discussing the abolition of slavery. After the end of the Civil War, she decided to move to the South so she could teach newly freed Black people during the Reconstruction period. And something that I found really interesting too was 100 years before Rosa Parks, there was an incident in which Frances Harper in 1858 refused to give up her seat in the colored section of the segregated trolley car in Philadelphia. And this event later inspired her to publish the poem Bury Me in a Free Land. She also advocated for women's rights in public speeches, but she also stood for African American women and strove to make sure that in this fight for equality between men and women that they weren't forgotten. She later went on to help organize the National Association of Colored Women in 1984. And one thing that was common through her works, especially her political work, she asserted that the mission of humanity was to reverse a society that had normalized trampling on the weak to instead create one that normalized helping others and upholding justice and morality. She was noted not only to campaign for racial and sexual equality, but she wanted overall a protection of rights, regulated morality, and promoted social welfare. All right, and up next we have Nella Larsen. And Nella Larsen was an American novelist during the Harlem Renaissance, and her experience is really interesting because she came from a mixed race family. Her mother and her half-sister were white, and her father was African American. So she faced this polarization of not being able to really fit into, or feeling like she could never quite fit in with the white or the African American community. And her mother believed that if she could receive a good education, that she'd be able to have more opportunities in life, and she supported her attending university. But apparently the university had a really strict dress code, and they expelled her. Contemplating this, Nella decided to go to Denmark for 4 years, and then later she returned to the United States and started working as a nurse. And interestingly enough, she was actually a nurse during the Spanish flu pandemic. And then she married Elmer Imes, who was the second African American to earn a PhD in physics. And a year after she was married, she published her first stories. And then they moved to Harlem, where she was able to mix with other influential artists of the time, particularly Langston Hughes. And her works delivered this commentary on politics, specifically racial inequality. She published 2 novels, the first one titled Quicksand, and the second one was entitled Passing. And there's an interesting sort of influence from her nursing and medical backgrounds in her works as well. And in the 1930s, she went on to divorce her husband, and after his death, she no longer had his alimony support, and rather than focus on writing, she went back to nursing to support herself. And so she essentially vanished from the literary scene, but after her death, her works received added recognition with the rise of racial and gender studies in the latter half of the 20th century. She has since then been identified as not only the premier novelist of the Harlem Renaissance, but also a key figure in American modernism as a whole. So up next we have Edmonia Lewis. She was deemed the first professional African-American sculptor. And again, kind of like Nella, she has this interesting instance of mixed race that allows her to pull on different influences. Her mother was a Chippewa Indian, and her father was a free African-American. So she actually went on to attend Oberlin College, but in 1859 she was accused of poisoning 2 of her white roommates and of stealing art supplies. And she was eventually acquitted of this, but she endured an awful beating from white vigilantes, and after this she decided that she should move to Boston, and there she dedicated herself to becoming a sculptor. And even though she didn't have a lot of technical experience, she began to work on medallion portraits, and she started to gain notoriety, and this financed her ability to take a trip to Europe in 1865. And going to Europe, she was really especially inspired by Italy and all these wonderful marble works that she was able to just see wherever she went. What's interesting is, unlike other artists during this time that would have assistance during the process of transferring the plaster molds of a sculpture into the end marble piece, she did most of her work on her own. She also suffered a great fear of not creating something original, but there's an interesting blend of Native American and African American influences that she could find in her heritage. She was able to draw on that for inspiration. Although, again, it's just devastating about these works that have been lost. Sadly, some of her works were destroyed, but some examples still exist, such as the sculpture of Hagar. And not only does it tell us about her talent as an artist, but they show us some of the detail of her work and the message she was trying to display in the particular choices of subjects that alluded to different themes of ethnicity and humanitarianism. And ultimately, these themes were what made her stand out from other sculptors during this time period. So next we have Tressie Souders. And in 1922, Souders was named the first African-American woman director. And she spent a lot of her earlier life actually working as a maid in Missouri. And sadly, we don't have a lot of documentation on how she ended up getting into the film business, but she had some experience with acting and with staging because she performed in amateur theater productions locally. And in 1922, the Afro-American Film Exhibitors Company that had offices in both Texas and in Maryland, they contracted Souders to distribute her film, A Woman's Error, which would be the film that got her the prestige that she was known for. And Billboard magazine, in their 1922 edition that was published on January 28th, said that her film was one of the first of its kind to be produced by a young woman of the African American race, and that critics that viewed this film noted its attention to detail and accuracy in portraying the lives of African Americans. But this just breaks my heart. Prints for the movie cannot be found. We have documentation to know that it happened and that it was significant, but we just don't have the surviving prints to be able to watch it. It's just devastating. But within the next few years, Souders moved to California, possibly to continue her career in film, but the records actually show that she continued her work as a domestic worker. And we don't have any other records of her working in films or other productions, but her influence is still very present. And in 2001, the Tressie Souders Film Society was formed, and to this day, it maintains the goal of supporting and preserving films that are made by or feature African Americans in non-stereotypical roles, and they seek to provide guidance and resources for aspiring filmmakers. And so last on the list, I wanted to end with somebody who is a contemporary figure who we are seeing the influence of today, and that's Ava Marie DuVernay. And she is an award-winning writer, director, and producer, and some of her works include 13th, Selma, and I think one that is perhaps her most famous yet, A Wrinkle in Time. And what's interesting about Ava is she didn't actually attend film school. She said it was a privilege that she just couldn't afford. But the fact that she goes on to work so hard and to create really in-depth and unique and lively works, it shows that if you really work at something, your talent will shine through. She's such a testament to that. She didn't even really get into filmmaking until she was about 32, and she actually was originally trained to be a journalist. So she was able to bring this different perspective to the film world, and 7 years later she directed her first feature film, and she's still directing and writing and producing today, and who knows what she's going to come up with. It's exciting to just sort of take a seat back and just watch what's going to happen next, you know? And one quote that she said that I really loved was, "Be passionate and move forward with gusto every single hour of every single day until you reach your goal." And one of my personal favorite of hers is Selma. It's a movie about Martin Luther King and some of his nonviolent protests during the civil rights movement. And what's interesting is actually an anonymous person in my hometown, this movie came out during my senior year of high school, paid money for our whole school to go see Selma in theaters. $500. That, I can't imagine what it would have cost to pay for, thousands of students to go, but still, even to pay for 500 students is still incredible. And I'm absolutely grateful for this because this was my first exposure to DuVernay, and it was just so incredible. It brought me to tears with the emotion that she was able to portray. There was just absolute suspension of belief on the part of the audience. It really helped to create a catharsis with the audience, to help them visualize a piece of history that, even though it doesn't seem that far away, it's still something that a lot of us are out of touch with. And she's a woman that's breaking the mold, and she's doing it as we speak, and I'm certain we're going to see a lot more incredible things from her in the future, so be sure to keep an eye out for her. So that's my list of 10 African American artists that you should know about. I picked these because I felt like they were creating art for something beyond themselves, but this isn't to say that there weren't so many influential and wonderfully talented African American female artists throughout history that were also striving to share messages of equality and kindness and love and peace. There are so many of these wonderful, talented women that don't get the recognition that they deserve. So if you're interested after looking into this, if you want to dig further in on some of the women that we've talked about, or if you want to look at other women that perhaps have been overlooked, I would definitely encourage you to do so and see if it helps you to understand something that maybe you don't understand, or maybe you want to get a better understanding of. That's the end of this episode. Thank you all for listening, and if you feel like leaving a review, if you liked this episode, I don't know, all the platforms are so different. You could give it a like, a comment, you could subscribe or follow. It's going to be different for each one. If you're listening through iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. It really helps boost the podcast. And thank you again for listening. I'll talk to you next week. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'm Kaylin. Bye.